Thanks for joining us on the show that puts you in the center of all things people, power, and politics. This, my friends, is The Pulse. I'm Rupraj. I know you probably took a break from political news this weekend, but the cycle never stops. So toss that phone aside and just hang with us for the straight facts. And we have a lot coming up, including we're talking about ruling season at our nation's highest court. The justices have a packed docket. The gun rights cases the Supreme Court rejected and what's on the emergency docket. We're going to take a closer look. And we're talking about the future of the Democrat and Republican parties. A former White House aide under President Biden and press secretary for First Lady Dr. Jill Biden and a Republican strategist you know well weigh in on where both parties are headed and where they perhaps need to go. And we're also asking you how much faith you have in both the parties and the two-party system in general. You had a lot to tell me. But we begin in Colorado, where this man is formally charged in that horrific attack over the weekend. Prosecutors say 45-year-old Mohammed Sabri Solomon used a makeshift flamethrower and threw Molotov cocktails into a group of demonstrators, calling for the release of the remaining Israeli hostages. The FBI is investigating this as an act of terrorism. Witnesses heard the suspect yell, "Free Palestine." 12 people hurt in this attack. Solomon also hurt, but authorities didn't say exactly how. Witnesses describing the horrific moments.
Fire, I saw people falling and screaming and crying and tripping. And I saw the attacker have a Molotov. He had 3 Molotov cocktails. One of them he threw inside of a group. At the group, and one lady lit on fire from head to toe. And then the other 4 people were also injured and in a fire, but not as bad as the first one.
This person that did this act, that's beyond words also, like potentially killing like this whole group of people. That's unconscionable that happened.
It is, regardless of where you fall on the spectrum of this topic. The suspect was living in the U.S. illegally. He came into the country on a visa in 2022 that expired the next year. Court documents say he'd been planning the attack for a year now. They believe he acted alone. Turning to Washington, where June only means one thing, at least at the Supreme Court. It is ruling season. All eyes on the nation's highest court, where rulings in multiple cases are expected this month. And they've got several big ones on the docket as we speak. For starters, federal workforce downsizing is on the docket. The Trump administration asked the court to allow it to move forward with plans to downsize the workforce, even though a lawsuit by labor unions and cities is moving forward. A California-based judge halted the firings, and a court of appeals ruled downsizing could have broader effects. The administration is arguing federal judges overstepped their authority. And you know, the administration has dominated the court's emergency appeals docket since taking office. In fact, they're averaging just fewer than 1 emergency appeal a week with the nation's highest court. Now, here's what we're waiting for rulings on right now. The Trump administration appealing an order which says migrants must get a chance to raise fears sending them to South Sudan would put them in danger, would endanger their lives. The judge in that case found the Trump administration violated his order by sending people from other countries who'd been convicted of crimes here in the U.S. to South Sudan. They're also challenging efforts by a watchdog group to publicly disclose information about the Department of Government Efficiency's operations. And another order blocking DOJ from accessing Social Security systems. There's also the birthright citizenship battle that does brew on. That's guaranteed in the Constitution, but the Trump administration tried to end that with an executive order. And the High Court also rejected 2 gun rights cases, one involving high-capacity magazines and the other involving bans on guns like AR-15s. Now, they didn't explain why they rejected the cases, but Justice Brett Kavanaugh said he's not sure the laws are even constitutional and predicts the court will take up the question in the next term or 2. All eyes on Capitol Hill as the budget battle begins in the Senate. We know where Democrats stand, but not all Republicans are on board. In fact, some are really concerned about those Medicaid cuts. Others say the spending cuts don't go far enough. And the margin for error, well, it's pretty small. Republicans can only afford to lose 3 members to pass some version of the so-called big, beautiful bill. The VP, J.D. Vance, would have to break the tie if 3 members end up defecting. Take a listen.
Has to stop, and this is our only moment. Again, it's been unprecedented level spending. There's no justification for $4.4 to $7 trillion in just 6 years.
Everyone said that Speaker Johnson would not be able to get this bill out of the House with his slim majority. He got it out. Leader Thune has a bigger majority.
Well, this Republican budget bill is an absolute disaster for the country, in particular for middle class and poor people.
And Republicans want to get the bill to President Trump's desk by the 4th of July. We're following this every step of the way. Another thing we're following at this hour, major developments in the Russia-Ukraine war. Representatives met for the second round of peace talks in about as many weeks, and they agreed to swap thousands of dead and seriously hurt troops. But there's been no progress toward ending the 3-year-old war, which started with Russia invading Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky saying today that if nothing happens after the Istanbul meeting, the world needs to turn up the heat.
Today we see the situation clearly. If Russia turns the Istanbul meeting into an empty talk, there must be a new level of pressure, new sanctions, and not just from Europe. We need to work on joint sanctions at the G7 level, including with the United States and with everyone in the world who wants peace. It's very, very important that each of our partners supports this exact approach.
This comes after Ukraine launched a drone attack on several Russian air bases, which hosted nuclear-capable bombers. Ukraine said about a third of Russia's strategic bomber fleet was either damaged or destroyed. The Kremlin said only several planes were struck. Turning to the trade war, where a call between President Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping will likely happen this week. That's according to the White House. Tensions, as you know, are high between the two countries as both accuse one another of breaking a trade truce they signed last month, where they both lowered those tariffs and lowered the temperature, too, at the time. China's Commerce Ministry accusing the U.S. of provoking new frictions, partially by restricting AI chip exports and stopping some chip design software sales. There's also the plans to revoke Chinese student visas. As Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick gives America's side of what happened, Democrats in Washington say Congress should get involved.
Bessent and Ambassador Greer went to Geneva. They made a deal with the Chinese. And really, the right way to say it is they're just slow rolling the deal.
Congress could vote to repeal all of these absurd tariffs, but instead, again, we have so many Republican members of Congress who are too afraid of angering Donald Trump.
And while the trade war with China has gotten a lot of headlines lately, Canada has been hit hard by the trade war as well. And we actually ran into a Canadian while covering another story today who talked about the impact she sees and feels with these import taxes. Take a look.
It really did affect a lot of things. I feel like I'm in a large group of Canadians having that same view of, staying in our own country and not supporting. But having friends here, I do try to support local because I know they're also struggling. So it's not just us and not the country in general.
And we live in a fascinating place where local means Canada, too. So many of our viewers watch from there. Back now to the trade war, though, between the U.S. and China. Secretary Lutnick says President Trump will work this out. But China said they'll take forceful measures if both sides can't get the tariff truce back on track. Stay tuned. The Chinese national accused of voting illegally in Michigan last fall has fled the United States. That's according to federal authorities. He surrendered his passport in November and was told not to leave Michigan. You remember that? But the FBI says he flew to China from Detroit by showing another passport. The suspect was a student at the University of Michigan. Only citizens can vote in federal elections, and every voter must attest they're a citizen when registering. The suspect was accused of lying both about his citizenship when registering and then casting a ballot during the early voting period. Well, Democrats looking for a rebound in 2026. Up next, we're talking with the former press secretary for Dr. Jill Biden, Michael LaRosa, how he says the party needs to move forward. And then we have a Republican analysis coming from Jason Cabel Roe. You're watching The Pulse here on Fox 2. Back now on The Pulse, looking at all things people, power, and politics from the D to D.C. Since the party's devastating losses in November, there's been a lot of soul searching among Democrats, questions of what went wrong and how to move forward. Tonight, we're getting some really unique perspective. Former press secretary to First Lady Dr. Jill Biden and former White House aide Michael LaRosa is joining us tonight. We thank you for taking the time to join us here in Michigan.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So, Michael, I want to chat about this. You know, you and I talked earlier, and I said we spent some time in Mackinac. And one of the things that kept coming up, even on a panel that I moderated with some folks there from the media, they said, hey, who do the Democrats have in the wings ready to go? Because before we know it, it'll be 2028. When you look at this party right now, do you see it in disarray, or do you see it in a reorganization mode?
You know, I don't see things as badly as some others do. I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind. First of all, nothing is frozen in politics. In 2005, we were in a very similar situation. Now, that's 25 years ago. But in less than a year and a half, what took place? Nancy Pelosi became Speaker of the House, and we won back about 54 seats in the House of Representatives and won back the Senate, all within just 2 years. And so, like I said, politics is never frozen. This town could look very differently in a year. But I'd also like to remind people that we did have a problem at the top of our ticket. But in places like Michigan and Nevada and Arizona and North Carolina and Wisconsin, they chose Democrats on the next line on the ballot in the Senate or for governor in North Carolina's case. So we actually did fairly well, considering about 9 million people didn't show up versus 2020.
Well, voter turnout's important, and obviously activating people to get out and vote is an important piece of this. And we know in Detroit, for instance, voter turnout is really, really low. Any surprise at all that VP Harris came and visited here so many times, Walz visited here so many times, but still 20,000 Detroiters voted for Donald Trump. In this day and age, does Trump just change all of this? And does the 2005 episode, so to speak, of the resurgence that you speak of, perhaps not even matter with this new way we look at things?
We'll see, because just as in 2005, the 2005 example that I gave, George W. Bush wasn't on the ballot in 2008, and neither will Donald Trump. So it will be a clean slate for the Democrats and the Republicans. And I think it's going to be a great debate and a great campaign between two parties with two very different nominees than we're used to. So I'm excited. I'm eager because I think the bench is very deep on both sides.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the names of the bench. And I'm just going to throw them out here, and you tell me yay or nay. Governor Gretchen Whitmer.
Of course, yay.
Andy Beshear.
Yay.
Who are we missing here on that short list so far?
Look, there's going to be a lot of folks, senators like a Chris Murphy. There's going to be maybe an AOC, maybe a Rahm Emanuel, or maybe a Mark Cuban or Stephen A. Smith. I think it's going to be very similar to 2020, where about maybe 23, 24 Democrats ran in the primary. And my opinion is the more, the better. I want the American people, I want voters, Democratic voters, to kick the tires and kick the tires for a good long year. And, you know, we're going to go with a communicator, somebody who can communicate a vision, but also who has a style and a temperament that is reflective of sort of a younger generation.
Michael, many Democratic voters are upset they didn't get a chance to kick the tires the last time around. Instead, they were told this is the candidate and this is who you got. I want you to reflect for a moment about what happened here with the whole thing with Joe Biden and with Kamala Harris kind of being put in there. Was there a time that you were watching this all unfold and you thought, man, this is going to come out later that that President Biden wasn't well enough to do this job?
Well, I can only say that I was just as stunned to see the debate as a lot of other people. It was a pretty jarring experience in my 3 years with the Bidens, and on the 20 campaign and in the first 2 years of the White House. I hadn't experienced that Joe Biden. But I will say I understand the frustration that many Democrats had. Unfortunately, I think the former President Biden is going to get a lot of blame and take a lot of arrows for getting out as late as he did and sort of really making it difficult and challenging for the party to hold a primary, a well-formed primary in enough time. That just wasn't the case. But You know, the delegates at the convention, they did have a chance to vote for Kamala Harris, some of them twice. She was on the ticket, on Joe Biden's ticket. And so many Democrats had already voted for her. But I understand the frustration. And next time, in a couple of years, we're going to have that chance.
Well, and Michael, I do want to ask you a little bit about that. Specifically, when you talk about the president, you know, he had said when he first ran that he was going to be kind of a temporary candidate and then make room for somebody else. Do you think he honored that promise when he first said that?
Actually, I think he said it in Michigan in March of 2020 with Governor Whitmer behind him and Senator Booker and Kamala Harris. But what he said was he would be a bridge. He didn't say when that bridge was. Now, to your point, I think most Americans made a deal with Joe Biden, and I believe they don't feel he kept his end of the bargain. I do believe that most Americans felt that he was going to pass the torch, and he did not. And you know what? The polling was very consistent for 3 solid years that they did not want that choice. And so he paid a political price. He was essentially deposed by our own party, and now he's paying a huge reputational consequence. And it's really tragic, and it's really sad as a Democrat and as somebody who worked as closely within the Biden bubble and the family as I did.
Well, Michael, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us here. I hope you'll come back on The Pulse. We really enjoy your perspective, and it's great to have you on here in Michigan.
Anytime. It's great to be here, and thanks a lot for having me, Rube. I really appreciate it.
We'll talk again soon, I hope. And by the way, we have someone you know coming up next, Michael. Jason Cabel Roe.
Oh, no.
Someone you worked with back on
the Hill
many years ago.
Back in the Melissa Bean days.
That's right. That's right. We have him coming up next. Michael, thank you for your time. We don't need to tell you 2024 went a lot better for the Republicans. And Jason Cabel Roe, Republican strategist, is up next with what the party needs to change, if anything, as we approach the midterms. You're watching The Pulse here on Fox 2. It is People, Power, and Politics. Welcome back to Detroit's only nightly political talk show. This is The Pulse. We're going to talk about the future of the GOP. Republican strategist Jason Cabel Roe. Jason, always good to see you. We spent some time out in Mackinac. I had a great time talking to so many leaders there about the futures of both these parties. And I just find it so interesting because, you know, you talked to Michael LaRosa, who, by the way, you worked on the Hill along the same time as him, that Michael kind of has a more optimistic view about the Democratic Party. Let's begin with the Democrats. Where do you see that party heading right now?
Well, I mean, I appreciate Michael's optimism, and he's not wrong about how quickly fortunes can change. Often that doesn't have much to do with your party getting its head out of its rear. It has to do with the other party imploding, and we are certainly capable of doing that going into the 2026 and even 2028 elections. I do think, however, that right now the Democratic Party is rudderless. There is no leadership. Those who are the leaders, say the Chuck Schumers, are under attack from progressive activists within the party, and I think Hakeem Jeffries hasn't lived up to the influence that Nancy Pelosi once maintained. And let's face it, she's a hard act to follow. But I also think there's some big schisms within the party on some ideological issues in which the Democratic Party has gone way out of the mainstream with the American people. And I think it's going to be difficult for them to inch that back because they don't seem to be trying to move past things like, you know, boys playing girls sports and some of the other more extreme social issues.
You don't think they have moved away from that?
I think there's still elements. And, you know, here we are 2 days into Pride Month, and if you go on social media and you look, even Governor Whitmer, her message was more about trans athletes than it was gay rights and people being comfortable publicly expressing their sexuality. So I do think they're having a hard time moving beyond that, and I think it's going to be a while before a true leader emerges within that party.
Well, the clock is ticking because, you know, we say 2028 as though it's a long time away. I think it's a stone throws away. I mean, if you really look at how long it takes to run a campaign, develop talent, and get them out there. Let's talk about the schisms within the Republican Party. I find that to be interesting. And as someone who advises so many people for all these years, when you see the Republican Party right now, it seems as though I listened to Essie Cupp while she was speaking there at Mackinac, and she said, I'm a conservative. I don't know if you know what that means anymore, but I'm a conservative who is not a Trump supporter, she said. Is there room for people in that party who don't believe that Donald Trump and his way of thinking is the future?
Well, regardless of what conservatives, and I consider myself a conservative, believe, we don't have much choice because Donald Trump's going to be the president until 2028. So it's kind of, what can you get done? And today's Republican Party is not the conservative party that I grew up in. And, I've been around this party, particularly in Michigan, my entire life. My father ran the state Michigan Republican Party for the first 10 years of my life. So I grew up in the headquarters as a little kid, and I've watched it go from a pretty liberal party in Michigan under Bill Milliken and pretty luminaries around the country like Rockefeller and some of the other more moderates. But then you had, the rise of Reagan and conservatism and then Newt Gingrich. And conservatism went from a pejorative to a compliment. And, everyone was embracing conservatism. But the promise of conservatism never met the rhetoric. We kept blowing through budgets. We kept doing things that we said we were campaigning against, and we were behaving very much like the party we were critics of.
And so then MAGA comes in, interrupts that, disrupts that, and says, hey, we're the guys.
Because of, I think, that betrayal of, we'd say we're going to do something on the campaign, and then when we governed, we thought we would stay by doing what the Democrats promised, and that was a way to get reelected. I think the base got tired of it. I think we had a series of bailouts from the auto industry to the banks to many other corporate behemoths that things went wrong and the little guy got screwed and no one was held accountable. And when we bailed people out or did bailouts, it was to corporations, not individuals.
And so then President Trump comes down an escalator and says, we're here to disrupt this, change this, make it different. And he did.
And he did. And so we're a different party today than we were 10 years ago when he came down that escalator.
I want to show you some things that people are saying at home right now who are watching. Thank you for your comments, everybody. We have Jamie saying one party seems to be against anything our elected president is for while offering no new ideas of their own. Bob says none whatsoever, talking about faith in the two-party system. Kathleen says she doesn't have faith either. Whitney says time for more voices at the table. And Amin says I have full faith only if they have freedom to serve their voters and not vested interest groups. Well, Amin, no offense, but I think that's the way politics works, is to serve those interest groups. What are your thoughts on when you hear this kind of this feeling of disenfranchisement from both parties?
Well, I don't even think members of the Democratic or Republican Party are in love with their parties right now. And I think candidate quality matters, and I think that's going to be what's most important moving forward. It's one thing to be a Trump-supporting conservative Republican, but are you qualified? Are you a good candidate? Are you, reasonable enough to get a majority of the votes in a swing district? And the same can be said for Democrats. There are some examples of them in Michigan and around the country, but I do think candidate quality is going to be really important because I think many voters are going to be wanting to look past their parties to find, people rather than who the party is.
With the MAGA disruption as the power piece right now, have the Republicans, do they have the same challenge as Democrats in terms of finding that next generation of talent that thinks differently than the establishment?
Well, I think right now, when you talk about the post-Trump, leadership, it's very much we're talking about people that are reflecting Trumpism. I think in the Democratic Party, objectively looking, there are a few people that haven't gotten too mired up in the progressivism. One of the names that you guys did not discuss is Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania. I think the other three names that you guys talked about, Chris Murphy and Gretchen Whitmer and Steve Beshear. Andy Beshear are to the public, I think, a little more mainstream choices, particularly Beshear, who's been pretty centrist in Kentucky. But I think people like Gavin Newsom, who spent their entire lives being far left progressives that are trying to pretend they're, conservative, are not fooling anybody. And the same with J.B. Pritzker. He's been a disastrous governor in the state of Illinois. And if it weren't the fact he's a billionaire, I don't think we'd be taking him seriously.
Jason Cabel Roe, it's going to take money. It's going to take influence. It's going to take the people on the other side of that camera to believe in it. And it's going to be an interesting one to watch. We always thank you for your time. Jason Cabel Roe. That is the Pulse for tonight. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Roop Raj. As usual, it was good to be with you.